Благослови, душе моя Господа, благословен еси Господи. Благослови, душе моя Господа, и вся внутренняя моя, имя святое Его.
Will mentioned, I taught church history and canon law for over 30 years. This combination isn't exactly the key to popularity or great demand. History, boring, say many people. Canon law. Here responses tend to fall into two categories. There are those who tell lawyer jokes, who tend to regard the canons as obsolete or complain about legalism whenever the word canon is mentioned. And then there are those who call at late hours to ask if something is canonical. Is there a canon about? And then follows something or other. Very often they're hoping to find a canon against whatever it is that's troubling them. If I say that there are no canons whatsoever on this subject, they think I'm not very good at my job. They expect clear and unequivocal answers, not long historical explanations. I give long explanations, as students know. Surely there should be some canons on the subject that's bothering me, whatever that subject might be. These two types of responses, the anarchist and the legalist, if I can call them that, may appear to be mutually exclusive. In fact, they share some common characteristics. They share the same, I'd say, mistaken understanding of what the canons of the church are. And this mistaken understanding, in turn, is based on what I would regard as a misunderstanding of the church itself. Both these approaches tend to view the church chiefly as an institution. No doubt a very superior institution. Its founder, Jesus Christ himself. But still an institution. The spiritual counterpart of a universal empire or of a modern nation state, or worse, as a kind of club like the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks or the Sons of Norway, an ethnic fraternal organization. And in turn, both approaches tend to view the canons as the rules and regulations proper to this institution, defining the power structure, the competence of the various offices, indicating the rights and duties of members, and so on. They take for granted a definition of canon law provided by a now slightly dated, but not that old, New Catholic Encyclopedia of the Catholic Church. Some of you may remember it as a reference work. The term canon law is used to designate the body of law constituted by legitimate ecclesiastical authority for the proper organization and government of the church as a visible society. This definition is certainly very appropriate for the Catholic Church. Modern codifications, the Code of Canon Law, for the Roman Church, the Codex of Canons of the Eastern churches, for the Oriental churches. These define the church's power structure with the Pope at its apex, and they provide procedural rules necessary for the proper functioning of this very visible, this very palpable, in many ways very blessed institution. But the question always arises, and it did with my professors, Catholic, when I was much younger than I am now, when we speak of the church and roles in the church, how adequate is this institutional model that we so often take for granted? Are there any alternatives? I have to add, Orthodox Christians face an additional problem, because the canonical corpus with which we are obliged to deal is very different from the modern Catholic codifications. The statutes of the various autocephalous Orthodox churches may seem very clear and well organized, but our fundamental canonical corpus is not. That fundamental corpus with which all the Orthodox churches have to wrestle, the point of reference for all of us. This is a collection, not particularly systematic, certainly not thorough, of ancient texts that vary considerably in tone and style. Most of these texts were formulated in response to very particular issues, to address very specific questions. I won't enumerate all these sources, but for anyone who has looked through these ancient canons, they deal with subjects often quite remote from our own experience, and certainly a number of them seem difficult to enforce or are known to be unenforced. For example, requiring candidates for the episcopate to know by heart the Psalter. I was hoping to be able to ask the Archbishop. I quiz him on this, but no. And certainly also many important areas of church life are neglected. There's practically nothing about what we would call the parish. And very little about relations between bishop and presbyter, bishop and priest. On the other hand, sometimes you find too many answers to questions, what should be a simple question, concerning the canon of Scripture, for example, the books of the Bible. We have in most manuscripts of these ancient canons 4 texts, and all just slightly different. How do you go about dealing with these apparent contradictions? In any case, these ancient texts gradually were gathered into ever more comprehensive collections. Eventually, these collections, often the work of private individuals, gained official church approval. Yet even then, they hardly constituted a code of law, whether East or West. For many centuries, these ecclesiastical canons were read side by side with late Roman and Byzantine imperial legal texts dealing with ecclesiastical matters. It was imperial law that supplied the bylaws for our churches, both East and West. For example, consider that concept of the pentarchy of patriarchates. Are you familiar with this concept? You've heard of it, I'm sure. Of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, in that order. It was first enunciated by the Emperor Justinian in the mid-6th century in his novella 131. Certainly elements behind it are varied, much more complicated in origins than simply God decreeing there will be 5 patriarchates like the 5 senses in the human body. But thereafter, this prehistory, the concept of the pentarchy gains practically theological standing, I would say, especially with the Patriarchate of Constantinople, history, and gives way to mythology very, very quickly. The question is, how are these ancient canonical texts to be understood and applied? The anarchist might say, these are just basically arbitrary anyway, like driving on the right-hand side of the road rather than on the left. At this point, they're obsolete, they're irrelevant. Let's move on. The legalist, on the other hand, might insist all these ancient canons have to be obeyed to the letter. But of course, this would be hard to do, as I noted. I also have to add now, that I wouldn't have a few years ago, some folks these days wax nostalgic for the symphonic relationship between ecclesiastical and civil that existed in the days of the golden days of Byzantium. They might argue now for a close collaboration of church with a friendly regime, however despotic that friendly regime might be. In any case, whatever approach is followed, some interpretation of the canons is necessary. You can't figure out how to interpret canons, ancient or modern for that matter, from simply reading the bare text. You inevitably bring something to this reading. So I've suggested the anarchist, the legalist, no doubt many others, bring to this interpretation, to their reading of the canons, an institutional model. But is this the only possibility? I'd like to consider just for a moment what the word canon meant in its original sense. Today, we most often think of canon as a piece of ecclesiastical legislation, something laid down by the competent legislator for the proper organization and government of the church as a visible society, as an institution. But that's not what the word originally meant. Originally, the Greek word canon referred to the plumb line used by masons or builders to determine true vertical. It referred to an absolute standard, not something that was more or less 12 inches long, but that was 12 inches long if you're talking about a measured foot. Not a bare minimum requirement. The word canon comes to be used with reference to the rule of faith, the creed, the canon tis pisteos. The word canon was also used with reference to behavior. Peace and grace be upon all who walk by this canon, the Israel of God, Paul tells us in Galatians. And finally, the word canon also is used with reference to a rule or principle of church order. And here it's interesting to look at some of the earliest texts that we call canons. The Council of Nicaea was mentioned already earlier this evening by the Archbishop. And in 325 AD, this first ecumenical council issued some 20 canons, but at the time they were not called canons. They were called ori, decisions. The canons of Nicaea, I'll turn more to one of them in a minute, already mentioned. In principle, all the canons with a lowercase c simply try to give concrete expression and application to the canon, uppercase C, to the church's rule of faith, behavior, and order. So when reading the canons, it's essential to try to determine what value is a given canon trying to uphold. What disvalue is it censuring? What is the theological point behind the canon? And ultimately, the point behind the canons is that the church is not simply an institution. It's a sacramental organism. It's formed by baptism, sustained by the Eucharist. Those responsible for our ancient canonical corpus were concerned above all with maintaining the sacramental life of the church. Structures and institutions were meant to safeguard this reality. They were not considered apart from this reality, much less something over this reality and controlling it in some way. They were, to use the expression of Kirill Varun, also mentioned this morning, scaffolds of the church. They are not the church itself. This sacramental understanding of the church, very important for early Christians, for their understanding of the canons, began to be obscured in the Middle Ages. I won't give a long history lesson now. The church comes to be understood above all as a divinely instituted, hierarchically ordered body politic. The Eucharist and other sacraments come to be understood as diverse means of grace dispensed by the church for the spiritual benefit of its individual members. As Father Alexander Schmemann liked to say, the church came to be understood as an institution with sacraments rather than as a sacrament with institutions. This institutional perspective began to be reversed in the 20th century. Specialists in church history, patristics, liturgy, Henri de Lubac among Catholics, Nicholas Afanasieff among Orthodox, many more. I know you heard about Father Afanasieff this morning. I wish I had been awake, but as you know, I was up late last night. These wonderful fathers of liturgical movement and canonical studies began to rediscover how central the Eucharist was for the life of early Christians. It was central not simply because early Christians received more communion more often than many of us do today, as a source of nourishment for their lives as individual believers. Along with baptism, the Eucharist was central because it shaped communal life. It shaped their life together. Therefore, it served as the standard, one might even say the canon, for evaluating institutional aspects of the Church's life, including its structures of authority. And I believe that was the subject of your presentation. I wish I could have been there, Anastasia. Anyway, with these opening observations, I get to First Nicaea, Canon 8, the canon mentioned by Archbishop Boris in his remarks earlier. To First Nicaea, Canon 8, and the principle of territoriality apparently expressed in it, the principle of one city, one bishop. That is, canonically within a given territorial circumscription, there must be but one ecclesiastical jurisdiction, not several overlapping jurisdictions. The text of this canon is too long to read. Its historical context has to be kept in mind. I'll try not to be boring for more than half a page. The Council of Nicaea was summoned by the Emperor Constantine the Great, 325 AD, soon after he defeated his last rival to become sole Roman emperor. In his newly acquired eastern half of the empire, the Church was emerging from a period of intense persecution. Disputes had arisen over the doctrine of the Trinity, and everybody probably is familiar with the name of Arius and Arianism and the origins of our creed. But also there were issues about reconciliation of the lapsed and a variety of disciplinary matters. A rigorous schismatic group in this period, the Novatianists, had already been in existence for many decades. At the time of the Council of Nicaea, many of their leaders expressed full agreement with the Church Catholic on Trinitarian dogma. That is, the canon tis pisteos, expressed in the Creed of Nicaea, for example. They even agreed with Nicaea's rules for calculating the date of Easter, which is quite something. This, in the eyes of the council bishops, this probably even more in the eyes of the emperor, who was looking for a strong and united church, this presented an opportunity. If the schism of the Novatianists was not over dogma, not over the faith itself, but over disciplinary issues, certainly we should be able to do something about this. Surely we should seek a graceful way to integrate their clergy into the clergy of the Church Catholic. The solution, I summarize, if in a city or village there are only Novatianist clergy, they may retain their ecclesiastical status. If, however, there is a bishop of the Church Catholic, he may grant the Novatianist bishop the rank of priest or a country bishop or even the honorary title of bishop, thus recognizing him to be a member of the clergy, an honorable person and not just a schismatic bum. But he alone shall have the episcopal dignity so that there may not be two bishops in the city. This is that principle we were talking about before. And I must add, in all fairness, this principle of one city, one bishop was well established long time before the Council of Nicaea, at least by the middle of the 3rd century. Exponents of modern Eucharistic ecclesiology, Afanasieff, Zizioulas, Schmemann, Meyendorff, many others who could be named, they've drawn attention to the theological significance of this principle. Certainly, It reflects a basic aspect of our faith, that in Christ Jesus there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, neither is there male or female. In him we are reconciled. In him we become one body. At the same time, we need to consider what this principle meant in the actual life of the early church at the time that our canonical corpus was being formed. We have to consider certain basic words, and Archbishop Boris mentioned some of them. The word city, for example, and related concepts, place, local. What does it mean to call something local? What is a city? We have to consider words like bishop, and along with it, the nature and exercise of authority in the church. We can't speak of church structures and practices as canonical without reflecting on how the meaning we assign to words like city and bishop have changed through the centuries. What does it mean, for example, to speak of the bishop of the local church, or the bishop and his local church? Similar phrases. I'm involved in North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Dialogue. Our agreed statements use those terms very often. For example, in the 2016 KETI statement of the International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue, 5-page statement, I counted 13 instances of local church. What do we mean when we speak of local church? I wonder if early church writers like St. Ignatius of Antioch would recognize what we mean when we use the term local. For example, Orthodox regularly use the term local church, the church of the place, pomestiny church, to refer to the ancient patriarchates and other autocephalous churches. Of these local churches, the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, stretches over 10 time zones. This is an entity quite different from the face-to-face community that one would have encountered in the local church of the ancient Mediterranean world. In any case, the territorial principle has had a prominent place in the ecclesiology of both Orthodox and Catholics since late antiquity. It is proper to call attention to its theological and its historical significance. We also have to keep in mind another point. It was the Roman Empire that provided the template for the church's evolving structures. And this was a template that took for granted the preeminent role precisely of cities in structuring society. This was a template that differed significantly from many societies past and present. To think of warrior empires, seigneurial agrarian societies, nomadic or semi-nomadic cultures of herdsmen going high up into the mountains in the summers and down into the valleys in the winter. Or consider, for example, ancient Ireland, where there was neither urban organization nor well-defined civil boundaries. The bishop was more like the pastor of a tribe than the religious leader of a specific territory. Or medieval Serbia, organized by clans, very few cities, with almost all the first bishops living in monasteries, not in cities. Consider also some structures today. The situation of people, for example, displaced Palestinians in Syria in refugee camps for a decade, for generations sometimes, or migrations of whole populations in extreme circumstances. Keep in mind the ways in which locality is not the only, and territoriality is not the only way that people live. We don't live so close to our place as we once did. This template from the ancient Roman world didn't begin by defining the outer limits or borders within which social controls would be uniformly exercised. We start out with a map, and here exactly is the boundary between this city or municipality, this country and another. And if we want to really enforce borders and boundaries, we build a wall. The ancient world was different. It started out with a number of urban centers, cities, each with a keen sense of its own identity, whose effective force, catchment, one might say, would be variously felt over a more or less extended hinterland. The outlying areas in the canyons, if you find anything relating to territoriality, it's what happens when between the bishop of this city and the bishop of that city have a dispute over a village, someplace between them. And so basically they say, well, if it's been yours for 30 years, it's yours. Practical solution, but there wasn't a very clear boundary to begin with. I mention all this because we don't have neatly defined territorial entities, like those noted by Archbishop Boris, with the territorial parish. I remember the days of the territorial parish. It's very different from now. We also have to avoid projecting even later notions of papal monarchy onto this church. The church in the Roman Empire was an ordered communion of churches, just the way that the empire was an ordered commonwealth of cities. Another thing to keep in mind, and again, this is more historical detail than you may want, but I like trivia. So do my kids. The ancient city was really very small by modern standards, even though it may have a very strong sense of its own identity. There were very few in the Greco-Roman world, the Mediterranean world, that were over 10,000 in population. We know quite a lot about Pompeii, for example. Around the time of the volcanic eruption that destroyed the city, the first century, it had a population of about 12,000 people. It filled, its total acreage was about 1/5 the size of New York's Central Park, because these were very compact and often congested. Only Rome, with a population of perhaps 1 million, was exceptionally large. No city in the Western world would be as large as that again until the 19th century. And I could add, we discuss another time, that Rome was very different from other cities in the way that church life was organized in the period before the Council of Nicaea. There were multiple communities within the city of Rome. Other major cities in the empire, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, Ephesus, those are the only other big cities. They range between 100,000 to 500,000 at their prime, and even at least Alexandria among these had peculiarities in its organization, just as Rome did, that distinguishes it from the typical city that we see described in Nicaea, First Nicaea Canon 8. We don't find just carbon copies of those little cities mentioned in the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch and other early sources. We find some. We also find exceptions. We have to keep in mind these exceptions because in scale they correspond much more closely to our own real-life situation. For the man or woman of antiquity, one's place was above all one's city, however small that city might be. Long after the Mediterranean world became a Roman lake, the city continued to form one's primary loyalties and aspirations. The closest thing we have to that these days may be the Boston Red Sox. or a similar sportic entity. At the same time, the city in the ancient world, the average little city, provided first-hand experience of all the ethnic, social, economic, cultural cleavages that characterized the ancient world. Differences between Jew and Greek, slave and free, alien and citizen, between educated and uneducated, between the elevated sentiments of philosophers, the bloodlust of the arena. And it was also in the city, to begin with, that the man or woman of antiquity learned about the reconciling and recreating world of Christ, usually by hearing or by the example of others, very seldom by reading or by mass media. The gospel was gossiped, the way it still is in sub-Saharan Africa today. The point here is that God's authoritative word, his message of reconciliation and communion, in the ancient world was effectively proclaimed and realized not just within the structures of the community, but also by them. The means of proclamation and its realization were one with their essential content. Early Christians did not just go to church, they gathered as church. They did not just receive communion, they entered into communion with God and with each other in the midst of a broken and fragmented world. So not just by their words, but by their very being, and more specifically, by their being together, they proclaimed God's power to save a fallen world. This made their understanding of unity inseparable from mission and evangelization, something that we easily forget about today. We talk about pastoral care of the bishop for his flock, but how does this relate to a wider proclamation when in the Gospel of John, Christ prays that they all may be one? It isn't just so that they have a nice friendly coffee hour and are spiritually uplifted together. It's that the world may believe. The world will not believe unless there is some way in which the church itself, in its whatever manifestation, shows this to the world in which we live. Another aspect of this early church, noteworthy, are what we learn from modern pioneers in liturgical studies, ecclesiology, fragmentary document known as the Apostolic Church Order. It describes the organization of a small community from around the year 300. It mentions, first of all, the bishop, who isn't yet a distant administrator. He is rather the immediate head of the community. He functioned, one could say, at once as the normal presider at the Eucharist, but also as the janitor. He was in charge of many very practical things in this community. At his side are several presbyters, a reader, and 3 deacons. They're mentioned in that order. In addition, there are 3 widows, 2 to persevere in prayer for all who are in temptation and to receive revelations when such are needed, and 1 to help the women who are ill. I mentioned this because note the number of ministers mentioned, rather large by modern standards, and also the diversity of their ministries. And if we were to turn to the Syriac East, we would find an even richer diversity. For example, the hymns of St. Ephrem the Syrian. In this situation, there is no clericalism. There is no concentration of responsibility in the hands of a very limited number of full-time professionals. No sharp division between clergy and laity, because there are, in fact, a multiplicity of roles. Rather, a diversity of roles, a diversity of functions within this community, a diversity of gifts of the Spirit which, even if they're possessed by individuals, are exercised for the advantage of the whole body of Christ. And this means also the ministry of presbyters and bishops. It's situated in a communal context. The authority of those who are in one way or another ordained to ministry can't be understood without reference to the believing community from which they spring and of which they are a part. We say sometimes the bishop, the priest, represents the authority of Christ. We speak of the bishop or presbyter as imaging Christ, as icon of Christ, as acting in the name of Christ. Keep in mind other designations are used as well. St. Ignatian also likes to liken the deacons to Christ, people who serve. And in any case, the bishop or presbyter was expected to manifest and exercise the authority of Christ in the way that Christ himself revealed God's authority to the world, in and through communion, chiefly by being the servant of all the community. There are other documents that give insights into the life of early Christian communities. I won't spend a lot of time on them. Consider simply in passing the appointment of a bishop. When a bishop is to be ordained, having been elected by all the people, when he has been named and found pleasing to all, that the people come together with the presbyters and any bishops who are present on the Lord's Day. When all give their consent, they lay hands on him, and the presbytery stands in silence, and they all keep silence, praying in their hearts for the descent of the Holy Spirit. The selection, the ordination of a bishop takes place in a communal context. The new bishop's authority also is immediately related to the community in which he is called to minister. It's expressed in its most basic form, expressed a few paragraphs later. This is in the apostolic tradition, often applied to Hippolytus, when he presides at the Eucharist, when he brings the rich diversity of spiritual gifts and ministries of his local church into unity and harmony in one loaf and cup. Let's turn from this sort of romantic picture of early church to the situation of men and women today. With modern urbanization, more and more of us may live in a city. That does not mean that we are of the city or identify closely with it. Something rather funny happened to me. I was in Fier a couple weeks ago, and the person who was showing us around, was saying that it was talking about St. Michael of Tver. Tver was a rival city of Moscow in the under the yoke of the Mongols, and St. Michael of Tver basically was betrayed by the Muscovites, and he was killed as a martyr in the court of the by the Tartar host. Rivalry, in other words, between Tver and Moscow. My guide had some 20 visitors from Moscow, and he was showing them around the city, and there's a big statue of St. Michael of Tver and many other things reminding us of St. Michael of Tver. And he was afraid that the Muscovites would be intimidated or annoyed by this apparent Tver chauvinism. But it turned out that of those 20, only 2 were actually Muscovite from birth or from upbringing. All the other 18, all were from other places. Moscow is a very big city. New York is a very big city. How many here are New Yorkers? You can be a New Yorker after being there maybe 3 or 4 months. But usually people have moved there from someplace else. Anyway, that's way off the point. Today's city dwellers very often have arrived only recently. They've arrived from their native village in search of a job, or because their company has transferred them to a new location, the job transfer, or as refugees fleeing from homelands torn asunder by gang violence or by civil strife. Even those who have lived in the city all their lives, their primary loyalties may lie elsewhere, with the nation state, possibly with one of the ideologies or economic systems that have been erasing national and political borders. There are many articles these days on the transnational character and the deterritorialization of the world in which we live. Certainly, modern human beings are mobile and rootless to a degree unimaginable in antiquity or in earlier centuries. Our great cities are amorphous and anonymous to a degree unimaginable in antiquity. Compared to an ancient city, a modern city is enormous. Populations of tens of millions. I believe Moscow's population now is over 40 million. But cities have very little sense of identity and even less a sense of community. A city often is simply an agglomeration of individuals with few common concerns or interests save when weather conditions become extreme. Given this situation, it's hardly surprising that men and women today have no clear sense of their place. In fact, they inhabit several places at once. Where they work, where they sleep, where they play may be miles apart. Their sense of place is fragmented. So very often is their moral sense. Behavior at home or with one's friends has no necessary and obvious relationship to one's behavior at the office or the factory or in dealing with one's business associates or on the job ethic. I've argued on other occasions, and I won't pursue it at any length, that our world today is characterized more by displacement than by territorial stability. The principle of territoriality that we owe in no small measure to our ancient Roman experience over the centuries has affected our relationship, whether cozy or antagonistic, with the civil authority and with the wider culture, as well as our conception of church order. But today, the principle of territoriality is challenged by mass movement of populations, economic dislocations, technological change, environmental issues, cultural deracination, many other factors so easily dismissed as non-theological. I can't think of any non-theological factors myself in the world in which we live. In situations like this, I really have to add, for Orthodox and Catholics today, with an earnest commitment to pastoral care, to say, this is my canonical territory and that is your canonical territory, runs quite contrary to gospel principles of unity in Christ, no matter how well the principle of territoriality once may have fostered community and communion. Certainly, it will not be enough to insist upon the principle of one city, one bishop, as though that will solve all the problems that beset our churches, Catholic and Orthodox, today. It's understandable and even commendable that Orthodox canonists and theologians, I think John Zizioulas, for example, and many people in the Patriarchate of Constantinople, that they emphasize the principle of territoriality. They give priority to the geographic aspect of territoriality, and so have episcopal conferences in every corner of the globe that don't really do anything. And certainly, it is rather silly that Manhattan should be home to a Greek Orthodox cathedral, a Serbian Orthodox cathedral, a Ukrainian Orthodox cathedral, and no fewer than 3 cathedrals that could be classed or once were classed as Russian. A far greater problem, in my estimation, isn't our silliness, our vestiges of ethnic particularity, our church festivals, our acknowledged expertise at dyeing pisanki or making baklava or what have you. The problem is our lack of credibility, whether within our churches or in our engagement with the world. In a post-Constantinian world, we have to re-examine our church structures, lest we mistake these structures for the church itself. And discussion this afternoon touched on some of those issues that are causing scandal and that reduce considerably the credibility of our churches. If we keep in mind the sacramental presuppositions behind the ancient canons, if we look for the canon behind the canons, we may discover that they, in fact, address a number of our contemporary concerns. Concern for accountability, I mentioned that in the discussion earlier today. Concern for transparency, concern for due process. We have to remember, as I've said, structural unity is not an end in itself. Christ's prayer that they all may be one mean that we should all be one as he is one with his Father. Unity without renewal of church life on every level. Unity without a lively sense of community and communion. Unity without a sense of mutual accountability and mutual openness. Unity without mutual love and respect. Unity that ignores the sacramental nature of the church in favor of a pyramidal institutional approach not only runs contrary to the canon behind the canons, it also is unlikely to be persuasive in our American context. Our disunity will not be overcome by having a pope in Rome and or Constantinople. It will not be overcome by having a pope in New York or a pope in every parish. Consider that early Christian community I mentioned earlier, which a diversity of gifts was recognized and honored and utilized for building up the whole body of Christ. We need that kind of sense of community in our parishes, and we need this at every level of our church life. But also, as we go about building a sense of community, we have to remember that the church is not just any community, not just another club, not just a political organization. It's meant to be a community of faith, whose life is anchored in the church's sacramental life and in its worship. I say this because it's wonderful when a parish has a vibrant range of activities and programs. Everyone loves a dynamic parish. It's not so wonderful when cultural activities and other pursuits take the place of worship in the life of parishioners. In any case, I believe today we need to reconsider our structures for communion and community. In the coming church, no doubt territorial entities, the parish, the diocese, even the autocephalous church, will play a major role, maybe even a preponderant role. But these territorially designated structures, even if we try to build a sense of community, these territorial entities will not experience, much less express, wholeness and reconciliation unless effective communication is established with other groups, with other territorial entities, with groups that are not territorially based. Not just ethnic groups, not just ethnic ecclesiastical groups, not just linguistic groups, economic groups, professional groups, but also service agencies, advocacy groups, lifestyle enclaves. Here one would have to include religious orders, support groups, special needs groups, networking that goes to NGOs, many areas that we've neglected. We prefer to set up our own entities rather than engage with others in a wider society that are trying to do this, accomplish the same ends. Communication, connectivity, all this has been important in the past, but I would say that while the Bishop of Antiquity brought together various special interest groups of the urban faithful and Eucharistic assembly, It's important to keep in mind, and I'm close to ending, in those unusual situations, those exceptional cities I referred to, the bishop brought people together in other ways as well, in large cities. In Rome, for example, important was the establishment of a common cemetery. Even in North American urban contexts and villages, having a common cemetery is a great way to bring people together, and not just those who are buried there. It provides a focus for a wider community than you will have in other ways. Or in Rome, in ancient Rome, by the twinning of parishes. Say you have a community that is largely Hellenistic Jewish community, another one that is entirely a Gentile community, or any number of other differences that could be mentioned, and there were these, having a special relationship between one entity and another entity can help build a wider sense of communion and community and of witness to the world than would otherwise be the case. Or also in Rome, after the rise of the monepiscopacy, stational liturgies, of liturgies that would be in one place or another, or in another, on certain occasions. When, for example, those who are going to be ordained to the priesthood during Embertide, the usual occasion for this, one Sunday would be in this, one could almost say parish, in this community, another in another, another in another, so that those who are being ordained would experience the full range of the church's life and not just a particular situation. Or also in baptismal seasons, where those who were preparing for illumination would go not just to their home church and be very closely integrated, that's also very important, but also go to other churches in the same communion to recognize the breadth, the diversity of the church as it really is. Here, flexibility, creativity are needed. In any case, I think today we can't rely simply on the principle of territoriality to solve our present problems. We need bolder solutions. Some of those solutions we may discover if we look more closely at the ancient canons of the church. And I'd like to end because I've gone on rather too long, but I'm sure you will have. I hope you'll have.
Благослови, душе моя Господа, и вся внутренняя моя, имя Святое.